Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. This time we will talk about structured logging. And this is a topic that unfortunately, or at least in the way that I have researched it, you find very few tutorials or learning points on it. And though when it comes to production applications, structured logging is really vital because it not only allows us to simply just log things, but also to be able to query for logs, to to construct complex search criteria for logs that actually match a certain criteria that you are searching for. And this is really vital when you're troubleshooting or when you try to fix bugs or find out exactly what happens in a certain sequence of events when something gets wrong or is wrong in your application. So it is really vital. And it's also not very complicated. It's actually very easy to achieve, at least in ASP.NET Core or generally in .NET Core. So before we get started with Visual Studio, let me just briefly explain you why actually structured logging is very important. Now, the problem that we have usually with log files is that they are unstructured text data. So it's just really some text there that is written. And when you really want to do complex queries and try to actually search for something, it's very difficult to achieve that. Let's simply imagine, for instance, like we have done in our previous videos, that we just log to a txt log file. Now, when you try to actually find a problem in your code and you know there should be some logs there regarding that specific problem, now it's very difficult to search for. Of course, you could use tools that are a little bit more complex than Notepad or Notepad++, but still the same problems remain because it's just text. It is not structured at all. So therefore, the goal for structured logging is simply to solve this problem by actually making the logs queryable so that you can query logs for certain criteria. And in order to achieve this, what we actually need to do, well, we need to make these log files machine readable, which is very easy. Because nowadays, what does this even mean? That something or a log file should be, or generally a text should be easily or should be readable by a machine very easy. And it's the answer to that is actually very easy, and we use it day by day. The data needs to be in kind of like a structured format. Nowadays, we usually use JSON. In previous years, maybe 10 years back, we used to use a lot of XML. But still, also XML is a structured format, like it is JSON. And we use JSON every day. And what do we do with JSON? Well, we usually have different type of application configurations that we read in our application, so they are machine readable. Well, this means that the core concept or the core idea of this structured logging is that we should actually create our logs in a format that is machine readable and therefore nowadays mostly in JSON. And fortunately, this is really not very complicated, especially when it comes to ASP.NET Core, because the Microsoft Extensions logging library supports structured logging by default. And more than that, most of the third-party logging providers, and we have looked in the series of videos here on the Code Wrinkles channel on, for instance, Serilog. Well, Serilog is one of these providers that actually supports structured logging out of the box. What this actually means for us as .NET developers, well, it means that we can simply use structured logging out of the box. We just have to stick to certain conditions or, well, to certain conventions, I would rather say. And that's exactly what we will do right now by jumping over into our Visual Studio solution that we have previously also used for all the other logging videos. So this might already be very familiar to you. Now, the core thing that we want to achieve right now in this video, we want actually to make these logs machine readable. So we want to use structured logging. Now, in order to do that, I have set up a few things here that are really important, because here we can see how powerful, or in order to see how powerful actually structured logging is and how useful it is when it comes to debugging or searching for problems in real production applications. And what I have done here, I have installed locally Seq. And Seq is actually a logging sync, so or a log file destination, where you simply could send your log files, and then, well, you can aggregate logs, you can query logs, and things similar to that. And it's useful to have such a tool, for instance, because, well, in a TXT file, even if you write JSON, we cannot really do a lot of things. So Seq is also free. You can Google for it and you will find it. You can simply install it on your local machine. It runs like a web server, so it is exposed through a URL, and you can just use logging to simply send your logs to Seq. Of course, if you want, you could use other third-party or other tools like maybe Microsoft Azure Log Analytics or other tools that are especially designed for getting logs and offering this great opportunity to query logs, to search or do advanced searches for logs and things similar to that. But for simplicity, we will use Seq because it's really very easy to get started with it. You don't need any subscriptions, any keys. You just need to install it, and that is then done. So nothing more than that. Now, the second thing that we have already done here is we have added actually to our project a new package, which is a Serilog sync for the Seq log server. So you see it, we have installed it here. And the other thing that we have done is, of course, we have configured a very basic Seq provider for Serilog so that we are able to actually send our logs also to Seq, not only to a log file and to the console. And in fact, we have added this as a using here in the Serilog configuration, and then we have added it as a write to target. And that's pretty much everything that we have done to actually set up all that we need for this video. So now we'll go here back to our weather forecast controller and get actually started with what actual structured logging means and how it works. So it's actually very, very easy. But before we really do our structured logs, let me just take these exceptions that we have here and let's move them somewhere at the bottom so that we can log different things here up. Now, let's for instance see how this could be useful. And we also, let's assume we would also like to keep track of how long actually this service takes to perform the task. So let's do this in a very, very, well, old-fashioned way, not the best one, but it's actually useful to just get started and understand why this structured logging is or could be so important. So here we just want to use a stopwatch. And we just need to add the using for that, and let's call it SW, and this would be a new stopwatch. So we will use this in order to see how much time it elapses until this service actually performs its job. But before we actually do that, let's actually try to add our first structured log. And the way we do this in ASP.NET Core, so we can already use the iLogger that we have, so nothing more than that. The only convention that we have to actually take care about is that when we write our string, let's for instance, let's say here request received by controller, and we want to specify the name of the controller. And here comes the first convention. When you want to use placeholders for the end result, that would be actually a JSON log, you would have to use these curly braces, and then you would have to specify the property name. And in my case, the property name would also be controller. So we have added this. And then we can say, for instance, action, because we want to see exactly also which action was executed. And then once again, this convention, we put these curly braces, and here we should put the name of the property that we actually want to have as a property in our structured log. So in this case, we will also use action, or let's use controller action. You actually can name these properties really the way you want. The only important thing is that you are consistent. So if you start to name your actions controller actions in structured logging, then it might be useful to really stick to that, because then when you want to do a query or an advanced search, as said, for instance in Seq, you need to have reliable results for that. And what we can even also say is, and let's go here on a new line, and we specify that it was received on a date time. And here once again we place these curly brackets, and we want to have a property which is called date time. And that's basically it. Now the second part of this convention when it comes to structured logging in ASP.NET Core is that after you have provided a string, you have to provide actually an object array that would actually specify the values for the placeholder that you have here. And let's start this, and let's say new object array. And here in this new object array, you have to specify the values for the placeholders that we have here in this exact order. So the first value that we would have to specify in this array would have to correspond to this controller. So we want to have the name of the weather forecast controller. So we use here a name of weather forecast controller. Then the second thing that we want to have is the controller action. So this means that the second thing that we would need to provide here is the name of the action. And here it would be the name of the action is get in this case. And then the third thing that we have here as a placeholder is a date time. So what we can do here is simply use a date time dot now and dot to string. And that would actually record exactly the time when this request actually came in. But now after we actually do this, let's maybe add this other log here that we already have, but we just change a little bit the text, and we will also change, we will also use here, of course, structured logging, because the next thing that I would like to achieve and that I want to actually be able to search for when I have thousands of logs is, for instance, which exactly service was called in order to, well, get the forecasts in our case. So what we could do here is we can simply say here dispatching to service, and then we have here a placeholder for the service. But here we don't need to use string interpolation. Okay, and then what do we need to do? We need to stick to the convention, and the next thing that we want to provide here is a new object array. And here in this object array, we can initialize it, and we just need to provide the name of the service. So in this case, it will be name of weather forecast service. Okay, so we should be good to go. I guess that should work just fine. So right after we have done this, we can just start our stopwatch. Start. That's cool. And now we get, for instance, we run the service, and then after we run the service, let's have this stopwatch stop. And here, for instance, after this, we can just log some information. So let's have here logger dot log information, just like we had before. Once again, we will, however, use structured logging. And here, for instance, we can say that, for instance, the service, and once again, we specify the service, so we need a placeholder for that. And that would also, once again, by convention, be the property name or the JSON property name that will be actually placed in the JSON log that will be generated. And then let's maybe generated a response in, and then let's have here, for instance, maybe elapsed time. You can even call this elapsed time, this property. So that would be it. And then maybe just add these milliseconds at the end so that everybody knows what this is about. And for the second part of the convention for structure logging, once again, we just need a new object array. And here in this new object array, we would have to specify at the first place the value for the service. So it would be, once again, name of and weather forecast service. And then we would just have to specify an object for the elapsed time. So in that case, it would be stopwatch.elapsed milliseconds. And that should actually do it. So now we log this information. Now we log the other information, which is the count. And I guess everything else we can leave it the same. Of course, we could add some structure logging for the warning or for the exception, like to include the name of the controller. But I guess that you got the main idea how structure logging works. We just have to stick to this convention. So just use, for instance, this placeholder where we put the JSON property names that we want to have in our logs. And then we have to provide an object array in which we have to be careful to provide the values in the exact order in which we have these placeholders here. Otherwise, you would get a mismatch between what you would expect here and what you really get. So that's actually the only thing that we have, or that we would need to be careful about. Anything else is, as said, handled already by Microsoft Extensions logging, and in our case, by Serilog, as we are using Serilog as a third-party provider. Now let's run the application and make a request so that we will be able to see then why actually this idea of structured logging is so important. So let's run the application. I guess it just takes a few seconds, but it should start. So we also have here this Swagger. Now let's just run, try it out, execute, and that's it. And that's everything we need actually. We don't need anything else. We can close down the application. Now we can switch over to Seq. And let's do a refresh here. And as we did this refresh, we see that we have here a lot of information. Now, a lot of the information was logged by Serilog already because we have said that we actually want to log different things when we have configured Serilog. But what we can do here is we can take a look. Here is the first information that we log. And already by the color, you see that that this weather forecast controller is colored differently, this get is colored differently, and this date time is colored differently. So if we expand this, and here is where you actually see how powerful structured logging is. Because you see that besides the text itself that we write, we also get here a bunch of key value pairs that correspond to the JSON properties that Microsoft Extensions Logging and Serilog have generated for us. Now here we can see that we have this controller property, which was the name that we have used, and here we see that we have this weather forecast controller. Then we have this controller action that we actually have created, and we have this date time, for instance. So everything that we have added to our logs or to our text, we can see that we have it here as properties. And for instance, we can see then dispatching the service to the weather forecast service. And in this case, you can see that we have the service name that was already added here. And then we have some logs that come directly from the service itself. So we haven't implemented structured logging there yet. So in this case, you see that the text is really just white. But then comes the other log when we actually measure the time that it took. And once again, we have the text. But besides the text, we have all these kind of like properties where we have this, for instance, elapsed time, where we have, for instance, once again, the action name, and we have the service. So these are the things that we actually have added by ourselves. And this is actually very, very nice because let's maybe just run the application again to just have a little bit more logs in there and show you exactly why this structured logging is actually important. So let's run the application again. Okay, it starts. Let's execute this. Execute. We have our results. We can just close it. We don't need it anymore. So we can just switch over to Seq again, and let's do a refresh. And we see that once again we have some other type of information. And in this case, we see that, for instance, we have this elapsed time, which is 5 milliseconds. And now, for instance, let's see how this actually works. Because we have here the option in Seq and in virtually all tools that would help you with log aggregation, you have this option to like write queries to just filter some specific logs that you are very interested in. And let's say, for instance, that I would like to, well, see a little bit how the timings of my service is. And I would be, or I would say that, well, maybe 4 milliseconds for the service would be okay, but everything that's more than 4 milliseconds, it's actually not okay anymore. So I want to get any logs to see if there were any cases when the service took more than 4 milliseconds. And this is actually very easy to do now that we have structured logging and that we have all our properties that we have added actually here in our JSON that is readable by the machine. We can simply say here elapsed time. We have here elapsed time. I want it to be greater than 4. And let's run this again. And you see that right now I just have only one log, because we had only one single instance where this service took more than 4 milliseconds. And this is really a very, very simple query, and this video should really not be about how to make such complex queries or create more complex or advanced queries for Seq. That's something that, we can do when we will have more complex applications, but this already shows us how important actually this structured logging is. Because once we have our properties and when we log in a structured format that is machine readable, in our tools that we use to actually aggregate logs and search logs, we can then create such criteria in which we can, for instance, pinpoint in a very, very granular way exactly the logs that are of interest for us. And without structured logging, this would for sure not be possible. And once again, this is why structured logging is really vital for each application that goes live. And it's really important that you log correctly, that you log really the important steps that might interest you when you try to debug something, and that you use structured logging, because it will really help you to search, to do extensive searches and very, very clear or very on the point searches for exactly the things that are of interest for you in that moment. Yeah, that's kind of it about structured logging. As said, it is really not complicated for us in the .NET ecosystem, because at least in ASP.NET Core, as said, the Microsoft extensions logging already supports out of the box structured logging, and most of the third-party logging providers also support structured logging. So the only thing that we need to do as developers is just to stick to these conventions where we specify here our property names in curly braces, and then we have to actually provide an object array, and we have to provide objects that would be actually the values for the placeholders that we have defined previously in this exact order. And this is really important to note. We have to stick to that order that we have used here in this text. We should also, for instance, use here when we provide the values. And that should be it. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to share it with your colleagues, with your friends, on your social networks, wherever you might think it might be useful, or reach at least people that might be interested in this topic. Because, as said, from my point of view, for production applications, this structured logging concept is totally vital. You can't really maintain an application without having proper structured logging. Also, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed that. That would also really help others to also discover this video as soon as possible. And if you didn't subscribe to the Code Wrinkles channel, then please do, because we try to create really content as often as possible, at least twice a week. So if you want to be up to date with everything that we create here new, mostly on the .NET ecosystem, then just subscribe and make sure to also hit the notification bell that you get notified whenever we create something new. And if you have any questions, if you just want to also jump into a discussion, don't be shy and use the comment section below. I would be more than glad to get in touch with you and really start a chat there. So that would be also very, very appreciated and awesome if we can really get to talk to each other. Once again, this being said, thank you very, very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.